Afternoon, welcome to Comensura's IR35 webinar. We'll be starting shortly. There's just a few more people coming through to today's event. So as I give a moment or two for a few more people to join, I just wanted to say it's great to see so many of our customers, recruitment agencies, and also organisations that we don't currently work with on today's webinar event. Just on screen now are a few housekeeping pieces of advice. All attendees will be muted throughout today's event, so please use the questions function if you do have any technical problems or if you want to raise any questions at any point about IR35. We will be having a dedicated Q&A session at the end of today's event. And we will be sharing a copy of today's event with you, plus some other pieces of information, and potentially, subject to how the Q&A goes, we may share some of that information with you too. Yeah, just let me know if there's anything that you need. Just moving on to the next slide. So let me introduce myself. I'm Jamie Eaton. I'm Strategy and Development Director at Comensura. I've worked for Comensura for over 13 years. In a number of different guises, from both marketing and comms, but also more recently in strategy, and I've been supporting our entire approach around IR35. I'll move on to introduce the members of the team. So joining us today, we've got some great speakers lined up for you. Firstly, on the left, you've got Daryl Miller, who is our implementation project manager at Comensura. He's got lots of experience in a PM capacity. Daryl was our project manager for the IR35 reforms implementation into the public sector in 2017, and is the project manager for Comensura again this time around. Do you want to say hi, Daryl?
Good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you. Next, we've got David Taylor, who's our implementation supply management director. Lots of experience again, and Dave is our strategic sponsor for IR35. Do you want to say hi, Dave?
Good afternoon, all. Thank you for joining.
And last but not least, we've got Alex Webb, who's got more experience than all of us in Comensura. Alex is our guru on all things CNET, our proprietary system. Alex, you want to say hello?
Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you're all well.
Thanks, everyone. So, so we're passing over to those guys shortly, but just for the benefit of everyone, but especially those people joining us today that aren't current customers of Comensura, just a single slide on who we are. So Comensura is a leading provider of managed service solutions in the UK and also in Australia. It's great to say that 120 organisations globally trust Comensura to manage their contingent labour expenditure. That equates to around about £700 million a year. We do that for customers in a vendor neutral approach, meaning that Comensura never supply any contingent labour or any labour directly. We do that through a supply chain of agencies, and we also now, as you can see in the third box, provide a variety of different solutions, both from a classic neutral vendor perspective, a more adapted approach in terms of meeting a more diverse range of hiring manager requirements in terms of their interactions with supplying agencies, and also in a preferred supplier approach as well for those customers that don't have significant volumes of expenditure. And we now have a very category-centric approach where we also cover statement of work, expenditure too. Our mission is to find a smarter way to work for customers with complex staffing needs, and that drives everything that we do. And we want to be easy to do business with for the supplying agencies that see Comensura as a route to market to supply good quality workers to customers, but we also want to be easy to do business with for customers and other partners that we have as well. So that's Comensura in a single slide. On today's session, you've got an outline now of the agenda. We'll be starting with Daryl and then Dave and Alex before we go on to the open Q&A session. I think it's worth to say at this stage, apologies, this is a slide from a session last week, so the times should be between 1 and 2, not 2 until 3. I think it's fair to say that in the last session we held on Thursday, we did finish about 10 minutes early. So we want to give lots of opportunities to Q&A. If those Q&As, if the questions rather don't come through, then we may finish early. But I'm sure I'm not going to get any complaints from anyone on the call about that. So that's all it is from me. Like I say, if there's anything you need, please message via the questions, and I'll get back to you. I'm now going to hand over to our first speaker, who is Daryl Miller. Thanks, Daryl.
Thanks, Jamie. So I want to set the scene and talk a little bit about what is IR35 itself. So what's the legislation cover in terms of the changes that are due to happen in April 2021? And looking at the next slide, we've got some information here relating to how IR35 is positioned in terms of the engagement of temporary workers or off-payroll workers. So in its briefest, IR35 is tax legislation relating to any workers who are engaged off payroll for a customer via an intermediary. Now that intermediary may be their own personal service company or a limited company, or could be via a third party such as an umbrella company on a non-PAYE basis. IR35 covers cases where if the worker was providing their services directly to the customer, they'd be considered an employee. But as they're engaged via the intermediary in this case, the required income tax and national insurance contributions are paid differently. The off-payroll working rules are in place to make sure that when an individual would have been considered an employee if they were providing their services directly, they pay now broadly the same national insurance and tax contributions, that's employers' national insurance, as a worker employed by the customer directly. In this webinar, we're going to use the term worker as an encompassing term for the HMRC definition that you can see on the screen in front of you now. So the reforms that are coming in April 2021 are essentially about creating a balance. Ideally, what we're looking for is the tax and employers' national insurance on contract workers versus the candidates engaged directly on a PAYE basis, doing the same job, are broadly the same. And the changes in April 2021 are also looking to provide greater clarity to the worker from the changes that happened in the public sector in April 2017 to understand the reasons why a role has been determined in or out of scope of IR35. This is important as whether a role is determined as in scope of the legislation or out of scope, it has a direct impact on the fees paid to the contractor working via an intermediary. If the contractor is assessed as inside IR35, the required deductions for employee national insurance and PAYE must be made from the gross fees they receive before any pay is passed on to the intermediary organisation themselves, whether that's the limited company, the umbrella company, or the personal service company as we discussed before. Employer national insurance and apprenticeship levy costs, where applicable, also need to be accounted for on the payment by the deemed employer. This change, as we talked about, comes into effect in the private sector in April 2021. But there are some important changes that are happening also with public sector customers from the original implementation back in April 2017. And I want to talk about what those changes are expected on the next slide. So after the introduction in the public sector in 2017, the HMRC went out to the market and sought feedback from organisations in all parts of the supply chain on the change. And as a result of these consultations, they have made some changes to the legislation as a result. On the left-hand side of the slide here, talks about the changes and the current situation now before the change in April 2021. So currently, public authority has a responsibility to decide the employment status. That's whether the role that they're engaging the temporary worker is in or out of scope of IR35. Currently in the private sector, the worker is responsible for deciding that employment status themselves. After the 6th of April 2021, both public, private sector, and some charities and third sector clients will be responsible for deciding that worker's employment status via a status determination. That status determination must include certain factors for it to be deemed valid, That is, they must include the reasons for whether that role is in or out of scope of IR35. And importantly, that must be given to the candidate up front by the organisation engaging the candidate directly, and also passed on to the next organisation in the supply chain, whether that be a service provider like ourselves, or an agency, or another company that you engage for the recruitment of that work. The responsibility for deducting tax and national insurance then becomes the part of the fee payer, that organisation that pays the intermediary. If a status determination isn't deemed to be valid, then that responsibility for paying that tax and employer's national insurance will stay with the organisation engaging the candidate until the worker and the person or organisation they contract with is provided that valid status determination, and most importantly, the reasons for it. That's quite a considerable change from the implementation in April 2017, that the reasons now must be provided in advance directly to the candidate. Previously, it was a case that you had to advise whether the role was in or out of scope of IR35, but now providing those reasons is a key part of making that status determination valid. Once you pass on that determination and the reasons for it to the next part of your supply chain, the responsibility for passing that goes further down the supply chain. So using a very small example, if you engage with us as a customer, you would provide the determination and the reasons for that determination to us and to the candidate directly. We would then be responsible to pass that determination and the reasons for it to the next agency in the supply chain, and they would then pass it on to the umbrella company, and further, and so on and so forth, until it reaches the last organisation. That's the determined the fee payer, the one that pays the intermediary for the fees that are then due. That fee payer then ensures any fees received for the engagement are processed in line with the determination, and any required deductions are made. So looking back at the changes in 2017, we wanted to understand what the key points were for the changes, what our customers needed to know from our experience of working with our public sector customers about the key lessons that we can use moving forward. Well, firstly and foremostly, it takes longer than you may think to review all existing roles and do a status determination. That responsibility becomes much more time consuming now because you have to engage with the candidate in terms of the reasons that you've made that determination. So if you're recruiting for a number of different roles across your organisation, and with our customers, we looked at the numbers and we anticipate there's around 17,000 job titles that are currently active and live on our CNET 5 platform. The responsibility for the organisation engaging those workers is to make that determination, taking the reasonable care that's required, and ensure that if a candidate is engaged within that role, that determination is passed on to the candidate with the reasons. It's a good opportunity here then to engage with workers early on in the brief forms. Candidates are obviously going to be aware of the change in legislation for the private sector. They're going to know that it's now the responsibility of the customer in terms of that in or out of scope determination, and they understand the impact of how that, if they were decided to be in scope, that take-home pay, the deductions that need to be made, are now going to come out of the fees they receive from the organisation they engage with. So they may wish to engage with the customer in terms of a pay review or a discussion around the impact on their take-home pay around that organisation. So it's a good opportunity now to have that discussion with the candidates as early as possible for them to understand how that determination is going to be seen and how it results in terms of whether it's in or out of scope and the reasons for it. And they can have discussions early in the process to engage with that candidate and look to retain the candidates if they are critical to your business in the role. Importantly, under the legislation change, a robust review and appeal process is key. Candidates have the right to appeal against the determination that an organisation makes. If you make an in-scope decision and the candidate feels that it should be out of scope, they have a 45-day period to challenge that determination. And you then have a responsibility as an organisation to listen to that challenge, investigate the reasons that they've highlighted, and come back to them with a response within that period of time. It's important to make that process robust because if a response isn't given to a challenge, you as an organisation then assume the responsibility for making those deductions, that employer's national insurance and tax, until such point as you go back to the candidate, respond to that challenge and advise them accordingly and agree a way forward in terms of the scope of that determination. A focus on legislative compliance first is essential to ensure you are compliant as an organisation, to ensure that you are meeting your requirements in terms of the responsibilities to the candidate and to the legislation is key. There are going to be some difficult conversations with candidates over the coming weeks and months, certainly in cases where they believe that they are in scope or out of scope against the determination that you make. So it's absolutely key that we make sure that we get everything in place ready for your organisation to be compliant as soon as possible. So coming on to your role in IR35 as a contracting organisation for temporary workers, what are the key things that you will need to do in preparation for that change? We've talked about that you must do a status determination when you engage a non-PAYE worker. Importantly, a PAYE worker will make the deductions for employers' national insurance tax through the payroll process. But any non-PAYE worker, where an intermediary is used, a status determination must be made, and it must be applied to the candidates that you're engaging in current bookings now. From April 2021, a valid status determination must include the reasons for your determination. So for the customers that have been through that process in April 2017 in the public sector, that's an additional requirement. It now must include the reasons for that, and you must pass those on to the candidate as part of the legislative compliance. That determination must be passed on to the worker directly by the customer and the next organisation in your supply chain, whether that be a service provider like Comensura or to the agency directly. Thanks ever so much for listening to me. I'll now hand over to Dave Taylor for the next part of our presentation around the role of an MSP.
Thank you, Darryl. Very informative. So I'll start off with looking at what is the role of the MSP. All managed service providers, including ourselves at Comensura, have a role to play. It is important that we support our customers through this legislative change. We'll come back to this point on some of the specific things we are doing to support customers over the next couple of slides. It's important that we flow the legislative liability perspective down the supply chain through our robust approach to contract management. So from customer to Comensura, onto agency, who in turn can pass on to the worker. We must take the determinations from customers and the supporting reasons and pass on to the next party in the supply chain. So in our case, that will be through to the agencies. Similarly, should they occur, we need to take the status determination challenges from agencies and pass those back up through the chain to our customers. It is important to clarify that the MSP, from an IR35 legislative standpoint, is not responsible for making status determinations and is not responsible for passing these on to workers. But that said, we are seeking to implement technical solutions to help facilitate the easy flow of the SDS from customer to agency and ultimately worker. In terms of a technical perspective, in CNET, our proprietary procure-to-pay vendor management system, or VMS, it will take the status determination details that our customers upload with supporting evidence and provide that detail to our recruitment agencies for each booking. The one takeaway really is that Comensura will act as a facilitator and provide a bi-directional conduit of information from our customers to our agencies and back again where required. So moving on to the steps that Comensura have taken. I'm strategic sponsor for IR35 in Comensura, reporting directly into our UK Managing Director. And it is important to state up front that we are ready for IR35, but with the delays to the reforms, we've taken the opportunity to refocus on IR35 and to hone and refine our approach. So far, I've set up 2 working groups in Comensura, an IR35 technical group that is tasked with defining the requirements for improvements to our CNET technology and other operating processes to support the bi-directional conduit of information I presented on the previous slide. Alex Webb, who'll be presenting after myself, leads those meetings, and he will give an outline of the technical solution as we believe it to work today. Also, I chair an IR35 working group that meets weekly and is responsible for meeting the overall objective of supporting our customers to be legislatively compliant by the 6th of April 2021. This group looks at broad aspects such as legislative compliance, communication plans, customer feedback, and also the technical group report back into this meeting. Comensura is also part of Impellum Group plc, the second largest recruitment business and the 6th largest MSP in the UK. Collectively, it's important to note, Impellum Group were asked by HMRC to provide feedback post the reforms in 2017. We are actively participating in Impellum Group's IR35 cross-brand working groups and are collaborating with colleagues on the best practice approaches to take. Equally, Impellum Group's legal department has dedicated legal resources for IR35 and has also instructed Ernst & Young to provide specialist legal and tax advice on IR35. Comensura are also in dialogue with Ernst & Young, and they have ratified the outline of our solution for IR35. Thirdly, we've instigated a customer communication plan with the launch of a new customer newsletter called Smarter Thinking. Plus, we've uploaded 2 videos regarding IR35 on YouTube. We'll share these after the webinar today. This webinar is also part of the communication plan, and we have more planned. Plus, we will be releasing more communications to customers and also via our social media channels. Lastly, we have a dedicated email address for IR35. As Jamie mentioned, we have a Q&A session at the end of this webinar, but I'd also like to encourage you to note down this email address and send us any questions or comments, as we are conscious people may wish to raise their questions not on this forum. We will do everything we can to reply with an answer. At this point, I'll pass you over to Alex to look at the technical side of things.
Good afternoon again, everyone. So what is our plan? So what technical development is planned? Our market-leading platform CNET5 already supports customers in the public sector to be compliant with the existing legislation. This will be expanded for the upcoming changes in legislation. Our focus is on ensuring 5 key themes are met. Ease of administration for customer administrators who are responsible for the upload of SDS and evidence. Simplifying for hiring managers, helping those that order workers who aren't typically going to be IR35 experts to have an intuitive and easy to follow approach. From a technical perspective, provide an easy pass-through of SDS from the customer to our agencies. The ease of review, so provide a method of regular review for our customers and your SDS for each role. And finally, visibility of reporting, giving you complete transparency. So moving on to these system flows. So the first phase is supporting a get-ready state prior to the 6th of April 2021. Here you can see a simplified process to show how we support and provide technologies to support the review of current job titles, reconfirm if the job title is in or out of scope, and provide the evidence. To do this in CNET, you or your CNET administrator will go to the job titles, view them, attach the SDS, and give a brief justification for this determination. This will be date and timestamped. Once this is done, the job title is now compliant and therefore ready for the 6th of April. So we all know that job titles can change over time and will require periodic review. So to facilitate this review process, we will develop a systemized workflow. This workflow will present to you or your senior administrator your job titles at a set time period on your to-do. This time period can be configured to suit your requirements, and you will then be able to mark them as compliant again, or simply update the SDS and give a new reason. And again, this will be date and time stamped. So moving on to our 2 ordering methods. The key change here is that, let me start again. So there are 2 main processes of hiring workers in CNET5. Firstly, on this slide is an overview of how we support the online ordering process where your managers create the order on CNET. The key change here is that post the 6th of April, the hiring manager will need to confirm the SDS, which will be pre-configured against the job title where the candidate is non-PAYE. When the hiring manager creates the order and selects the job title, the existing SDS will be pulled onto that order and displayed to them. They can then review is correct for this placement and confirm. Only once confirmed will the order then be released to the agencies. Once an online order has been filled by a worker, it becomes a booking. And as with the job titles, the IR35 scope can change over time. To ensure that these changes are reviewed, the system will periodically prompt you to review these bookings. Again, these will put on your to-do and allow you to confirm the SDS or allow you to add a new SDS and a reason for the change. Hopefully moving on to our direct model now. Thank you very much. So what's showing on screen is currently our direct booking process. So some of you may or may not utilize the direct model. So what happens in this process is typically the workers have already been selected before they are entered onto CNET. These conversations have already taken place between the hirer and the supplier. So the hiring manager will call or email the supplier, set out their requirements, and the agency is the one responsible for creating the booking. When they create the booking, the agency selects the job title, which again pulls through the SDS, which has been pre-configured, meaning the supplier has been provided that SDS. As I discussed with the online bookings, the scope can change over time, and the direct bookings will be included in this review process previously mentioned. So this is giving you a very high-level overview of our two main processes of how hiring manager engages an agency worker, and you as the customer will remain compliant with IR35. The aim for all of these developments I've discussed is to be in place for mid-March, giving you time to upload the SDS and reasons for all your existing job titles. Comensura will of course be on supporting you to upload the SDS to your job titles and to prepare and train you for the review process. So thank you for your time today. I'll hand you back to Dave.
Thank you, Alex. So from the perspective of treating this as a project and where we are in November, we would advise all our customers that if you haven't begun to formalise how their existing roles and candidate placements will be assessed as required by the legislation, then this needs to be a priority now. Where some customers currently have hundreds or thousands of active roles and bookings, ensuring that sufficient reasonable care is taken to determine the IR35 status for each one will require suitable time and planning. As Darryl mentioned earlier, we held over 17,000 current job titles for customers. So for the majority, we are looking at hundreds of individual requirements. Comensura will provide each customer with a list of all current active job titles and the details as to when the job title was last used for an order, booking, and timesheet. We envisage over the next 2 to 3 weeks that this exercise will have been completed to circulate the information. Customers can use this as an opportunity to review the current job titles and to ensure they are still up to date and potentially deactivate any old or legacy job titles. Consideration must be given to allow candidates to receive the determination and challenge if they wish. All determinations must be provided to Comensura by no later than mid-March, as Alex covered, to allow sufficient time for the CNET 5 system to be updated accordingly. So, in summary, on the next slide, the legislation changes effective the 6th of April 2021 and will affect all sectors, public, private, and voluntary. To be compliant will require planning for, and actions will need to be taken now to ensure all organisations have sufficient time to plan and implement the required actions to ensure compliance. From our experience of lessons learned in the 2017 IR35 reforms, implementation, as Darryl touched on earlier, we recommend to act today. Status determination statements and the supporting reasoning is required for each and every job title and to be passed down the supply chain and to the workers directly. The liability for unpaid deductions will fall onto the organisation if a determination is not in place, made without reasonable care, and provided to the candidate, plus provided to the service provider in good time prior to the go-live date. Comensura will support all our customers, ensuring they are compliant in time for April 2021. And that support will continue after April to prompt customers to regularly review and up-to-date determinations as required. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Thank you, Daryl, and also Alex for your presentations, and apologies with the losing the screen there. I'm not quite sure what happened, but we're going to move on now quickly to the Q&A session, and we've had quite a few questions coming through, so I will open those up. But as I said at the start, please feel free to send your questions through. We have deliberately left quite a bit of time in the session to allow you to ask you the questions, so send them through as quickly as you can. But I'm going to make a start, and we will go to a question that's just a point of clarity, I think, probably one for you, Daryl, around the legislation and what's termed as a blanket decision. And can you just clarify as to whether that's now allowed in the reforms?
Hi, thanks, Jamie. No, blanket determinations are not allowed in the reforms. You can make a broad job title determination initially to give you some guidance in terms of how the role is engaged for, whether it's an office holder, whether you're prepared to accept substitution as a client, mutuality of obligations, and other factors that various tools in the marketplace will ask you in terms of that overall determination. However, the reasonable care aspect of that determination is quite key. You must make a determination based upon the individual worker that you're engaging, as opposed to the job title. There are clarifications around making group determinations. So potentially, if you were to engage a series of workers in the same job title at a given point, and none of those workers are to work in any different way, so it's always going to be within an office, it's always going to be using your equipment, it's always going to be under the supervision and direction and control of the customer, you're not going to be prepared to accept any substitutions, then as long as you can confirm that that series of workers will all be under the same terms and conditions and the same determination can comply, because the reasons are all valid for every single worker, but you cannot make a broad scope decision and apply it to every individual placement. You have to confirm that determination is still relevant, so the terms and conditions that you used to deem at the time are still correct, or you need to do an individual assessment if any of those terms and conditions were to change. Thank you.
Thank you, Daryl. Okay, let's move on to the next question. A question here: do we need to do determinations retrospectively for existing job titles in CNET that haven't had a CEST tool completed? Who wants to take that one, Daryl?
I'll take it, Jamie. Yeah. Yes, the legislation has modified since April 2017, and one of the important clarifications around the modification is that you have to provide the reasons that you've made that in or out of scope decision, and you must apply them to the candidate directly as an organisation that engages temporary workers and to the next part of your supply chain. So if you have a job title now that you've made a determination for historically as a public sector customer, as in or out of scope of IR35, you now have that requirement to provide the reasons that you've made that determination. So it is part of the process and will be required for legislative compliance. Thank you.
Thank you, Daryl. We'll go with another question from the same person, actually. So we may have covered this off now, but the question was, at what stage of the order process would an assessment be completed as a job title is set up, or once a candidate is chosen and we would like to appoint?
Shall I take that one, Jay?
If you want to. Do you want me to go back to one of the previous slides on the flow?
No, it's fine, thanks, Jamie. No, so you can do a broad scope, or you can do a broad scope. So sorry, more correctly, you can do a role determination. So when you set up a job title initially, when you're looking to engage that post, you will have an idea of how you intend that an individual to work within that organisation. So you could look at it and say, would I be prepared to accept a substitute? Will that person be under supervision, direction and control? In essence, will the worker, if he was engaged directly, be considered a PAYE direct employee? Each time you engage a temporary worker in that role, you should ensure that determination is still correct and relevant for the worker that you're choosing to engage if they're going through an intermediary, so on a non-PAYE basis. So when the determination was originally done, it may have changed, adapted, evolved in terms of how you wish to engage that person, whether you would accept a substitute, mutuality of obligations, and other factors that we've talked about today. So the best and most correct process would be to do a determination each individual time that you engage a worker, but you can use a role job title determination to give you some indication whether you believe that role is likely to fall in and out of scope. But you must always confirm that it's still applicable when you engage the candidate and supply the reasons for your determination at point of engaging that worker if they're on a non-PAYE basis. Thank you.
Thanks, Darryl. Okay, let's move on. I think we've covered that one. That's very similar question. Yeah, so just to, well, the question was around when an order is raised, for example. So maybe we do with this one, just go back to the slide on orders. So this is the online ordering process flow. So do you want to just talk through this one again, Darryl or Alex?
Yeah, sure, happy to. So we talked about an order being raised here online by a manager from an organisation using the CNET5 system. And at this point, we talked about a status determination for the job title itself. So that process where you're looking at your job title and how you choose to engage that worker. Once the order is fulfilled, you'll be asked to confirm that that status determination is applicable for the individual that you're engaging on this basis. So that confirmation step that we talk about. So the reasons that you've made that determination are still valid and relevant for this individual on a non-PAYE basis. Once that confirmation comes through, we can then release it to the agencies as appropriate. So when the agencies are talking to candidates and looking to source and fulfill for that role, they've got the reasons for the determination at that stage, and obviously the job title to say whether the role will be in or out of scope for IR35.
Thanks, Darryl. And yeah, just for clarity for people on the call, in terms of easy to do business with, this is why the step before is so important. So this pre 6th of April getting ready state to determine job title reviews, whether they're in or out of scope, and the SDS and the evidence uploaded then flows through to this process and confirmation. So if the SDS is still applicable, it's a confirmation at that point. The SDS work has already been done, it's already uploaded, etc., and then it's released to agencies. Okay, thank you for that one, Darryl. Let me just have a look again at some more questions. We've got quite a few coming through, so this is great. Okay, so I think we've covered all of that one. So is SDS by job title too general? Does it need to have to be completed for each candidate contract?
It can be seen as general, but what we're saying here is that the status determination is a point where you're looking at how you would engage the role generally, so whether you would accept a substitute. To be totally clear on this point, in terms of the legislative requirement, you should validate that that job title determination is still right and applicable for the candidate you are engaging if they're on a non-PAYE basis. So to give an example, if you engage a project manager, it may be when you initially look at the job title that you're going to have them in the office, they're going to be directed and supervised and controlled by an individual that works for your organisation. You wouldn't be prepared to accept the substitute. There's a mutuality of obligation there and various other factors in terms of determining that that role is in scope of the IR35 legislation. When you go to engage that individual as a project manager and you becomes applicable that it's a non-PAYE worker, actually through the conversation and hiring process, you've agreed that you would set a substitute or other factors in that determination factor that you have to then revisit, re-go through the assessment process for establishing that valid SDS and determining whether that role is still in scope or out of scope for this particular individual that you're engaging. So there is absolutely an obligation to make sure it's still correct and appropriate for the individual engaging at point of hire, but you can do some preparatory work, as Jamie has said, to look at how you intend to engage a worker to give you an idea as an organisation whether that role would largely fall in or out of scope of IR35. What you must do is let the candidate know, check the reasons are still valid, and prepare those reasons in advance of that engagement. Thanks, Jamie.
Thanks, Darryl. Just going back to the Q&A slide. So quite a few questions are coming in on how can we say, it's almost like a template. I'm making an assumption here. I've gone back to at least one person to ask for clarity on this one, but the question I assume at this point, and please let me know if I'm misassuming what you say, is around if there is a standard template to work from. By that, I think, is there an SDA template with a set of reasons that are standard? That I don't believe is the case, but Darryl, do you want to answer around the SDS template and the approach required?
Yeah, you're quite correct. There is no standard template for a status determination. There's many tools available in the marketplace to help organisations that engage temporary workers reach a determination as whether to in or out of scope. The HMRC website itself holds what's known as the CEST tool, so an available tool which asks a series of questions through a decision tree to establish whether a role would be considered in or out of scope, or in some cases an indeterminate reason is established. But yeah, the legislation doesn't make any definition as to how you reach that. What it does state is that a customer must take reasonable care and must supply the reasons for the determination up front. The HMRC have also said they will stand by the CEST tool in terms of results. So if you do input the information and it tells you the role is out of scope, they will say that they will stand by that, but only in cases where the questions have been answered correctly with some validity by the organisation, which is a little bit of a get out of jail free card, but that's probably the best tool, I would say. It's probably the HMRC tool in terms of making that determination around whether a role is in or out of scope, and having a robust internal process to make sure that you're recording what the determination is, capturing the output of that CEST tool once you've used it, and ensuring that it's periodically reviewed, similar to the process we talked about in the CNET 5 system, to ensure that those determinations, those working terms and conditions, those factors that you will be asked questions on using those kinds of tools, the CES tool and other available options in the marketplace, to determine that result are accurate, correct, and still relevant for your organisation and the way you engage the temporary workers. Thanks, Jamie.
Yeah, thanks, Darryl. So lots of options in the market for people to choose which template they wish to use. The key thing being is we will provide in CNET an ability for either us to upload them on your behalf, the outputs of those systems like CEST, as an attachment, a document in that sense, or for you to do that for yourself. But we'll come out with more information on that. Okay, so apologies. Next question. So if the SDS is confirmed as applicable, is it possible to notify the worker via CNET, or does the customer separately need to communicate that information out?
If that was me, so
Alex,
the responsibility is with the supplier, but yes, it could be developed to be added into CNET if that become a common requirement. We could put it on their profile, but that would assume that they actually logged into CNET, and not all workers do. So that's why it should sit with the supplier.
I think just to add to Alex's answer there, the legislation makes the requirement for the organisation engaging the worker to ensure that the status determination and the reasons are passed directly to the candidate. So yes, you can use our system as a way of carrying that status determination and the reasons for it, the CNET 5 system, so it will carry those, and it will then make those available to the agency, or the intermediary in this case, to pass on to the worker. But as Alex quite rightly says, we've got no way of ensuring that goes to the candidate directly, unless we look at potentially, if it becomes common output, potentially developing something. But as a customer, I've got no way of evidencing that I have given that to the candidate directly using a system portal or various tools, because it relies on those interactions and manages those interactions. The most risk-averse way of doing it would be, if you do appoint a candidate, is to ensure that as part of their onboarding process, potentially the day one onboarding process, or maybe earlier, if you're going through an interviewing process, is to tell them the role is considered in or out of scope, and providing them the reasons with potentially a document as part of that onboarding pack that they sign to confirm that they have received that from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Darryl. Thank you, Alex, for your responses there. Another question, can contractors challenge IR35 decisions?
Yes, they can. It's within the legislation that they are enabled to challenge it at any point once they receive the determination and the reasons of the determination, and there is a defined time period that an organisation has to respond to that challenge. I mentioned during my presentation, I think it's between 40 and 45 days. I will come back and clarify that for the people on the call once I've reviewed and checked the legislation, so I'll come back to you on that. But yes, they can. You have to have a process to be able to review and respond to that challenge. And if you don't respond and review within the time period that's outlined within the legislation, you as an organisation assume responsibility for the cost of the employer's national insurance and tax deductions that are to be made during that period. Importantly, during that period of time where you are going through that review process, as I say, I think it's between 40 and 45 days, the requirement is still to process payments in line with your original decision. So if you say roll it in scope, during that 45-day process that we talked about, where you're going through that review process, the deductions still continue to be made in line with your original decision. If at the end of that process, you've made the review, you've looked at the reasons again, and that determination changes, obviously you can let the candidate know that it's out of scope, you can provide the reasons for that. And in terms of the payments that the candidate has made, or the intermediary more correctly has made in terms of employers' national insurance and tax, that can be taken up with the HMRC directly to reclaim that upon the basis of the new reasons that have been supplied. Thank you.
Thank you, Darryl. I'm just looking through to see if there's any more questions. Okay, I think we've just covered that one. Yeah, so this is, can CNET notify the worker? So we've covered that one, yes, in terms of CNET will act as that end-to-end kind of conduit flow. That's the intention for the information to flow through from yourselves all the way down to worker. So we've covered that one. What form does the notification to the worker take? I.e., is it a templated letter or a copy of the SDS?
It doesn't make any provision for the formal format of that notification to the worker. You just have to evidence that you've told them, or you've given them a valid determination. So you've told them whether the role's in or out of scope, and you've provided the reasons that you've reached that decision. Depending on how you've reached that decision as an organisation and what factors you've taken into that. We've used the HMRC CEST tool as an example, but you may use one of the other options that's available in the marketplace. You just have to ensure that you've provided the reasons to the candidate and your decision as to whether it's in or out of scope of IR35 for their organisation and their intermediary. And you, as a suggestion, would have a process of capturing that you've handed that to them. So I talked about a signed declaration in my last answer. Something along those lines to evidence that you've given it to them would be sufficient. But there's no template way of doing that. You just need to ensure that as an organisation, you could demonstrate that you had followed that process and you had given it to the candidate as you are required to do so.
Yeah, and just for a point of clarity, within CNET, what's our approach if the determination's uploaded into CNET? So that in a sense is, if that was a CES tool, am I correct in saying this, Darryl? If it's a CES tool that's output to say, I don't know, let's say PDF, it could be uploaded into CNET and passed from customer to Comensura down to agency and ultimately to worker.
Yes, the system will have the ability to capture an attachment in a variety of forms, PDF and various others. So yes, you can upload it as an attachment, and yes, we can make that available to the agency to pass on further down the supply chain via our CNET 5 platform. And ultimately, you would hope that the agency would also make that available to the worker as necessary. But back to the point I've made before, the indication in the legislation is that you, as a customer that's engaging these types of individuals, must be able to evidence that it's been passed to them. I don't know if it would be sufficient to say, well, I've provided it to my service provider, but I can't evidence that I've given it to the worker, because there's no responsibility on the service provider or any other part of the supply chain to supply that to the worker. The emphasis is on the customer to do so.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for that clarity. Thank you, Darryl. Okay, I think we've got a couple of minutes left. I think we've been through the questions. Apologies if I've not answered your question directly. It's because it's very closely aligned to a question that we have answered. But we'll just give another second or two just to see if there's any more questions that you want to go through. If not, we'll move on to reconfirming next steps for you. Okay, so just give that a second. I will just close that down. Nothing's coming through, so we'll move on to the final few slides. Okay, so in terms of the next steps, the outline plan is as follows. So this may is likely to already have happened or started to happen with all Comensura customers at this moment in time, either through your dedicated head of service or your business partner that works on each customer account. And the key thing here is to internally for yourselves as customers and organizations to think about who is the key contact for IR35 compliance. It really helps from a project perspective to have someone with that defined role, and those conversations can then take place with Comensura and that individual. We will supply all customers with a list of all active job titles to assist with the initial status determination. The outline of that report will, in summary, provide you with a list of all job titles and also details to when that job title was last used in terms of an order, if it was used for a booking, or if there's timesheets against it. As mentioned on one of the previous slides, this is a good opportunity to also do a little bit of housekeeping. If there are some job titles no longer required, we'll be providing evidence that will suggest that may be the case. It's then up to you to decide whether you want to house clean a little bit. But equally, we'll work with you to determine which job titles require the SDS to be gathered from your perspective. Moving on from that, we'll then agree on the date by which those determinations will be completed and supplied. I think Dave or Daryl touched on this. There's 17,000 job titles in the CNET system, so we need to think about volumetrics and ensuring that we can get SDSs into CNET in the most time efficient way. So we'll be communicating with customers, but as we said, the blanket kind of date is by the middle of March, but clearly for some larger customers with larger volumes of SDSs, potentially we may wish to get those that evidence in sooner, but that will be part of the engagement with each individual customer. But you'll certainly get the list of all active job titles this side of Christmas. You'll have that in the next week or so. We will share a copy of this recording and other resources, such as some links to IR35 webinars for you as well, and that will follow in the next day or two after this event. Okay, so that's the end of today's session. I just wanted to thank everyone again for investing your time in joining us today. I really hope that you've taken a lot from the session. It's the start of this process for us. There'll be more communication coming out, so please look out for that. And as you can see on screen, there is the ir35@comensura.co.uk email address. Please email through with any questions or any support you require on IR35 to that address. That's centrally managed. Daryl, who's spoken a lot today, has direct access to that mailbox, and we do intend to answer back and support as best as we possibly can. So yeah, send through that any questions there. That email is applicable for customers, agencies, and also organizations that don't currently work with Comensura, so please feel free to use it, and also look out for more information coming on our digital social media channels. But we're going to finish about 5 minutes early, so I appreciate all of you for taking your time, as I said before. Thank you once again, and I wish you a good end to your day. Okay, Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.